When discussing ethics, there's a number of different systems that one can use in order to figure out what's the right thing to do. You can use utilitarian frameworks, deontological frameworks, libertarian frameworks, among many others, and I've done lectures on various frameworks such as these, but I think it's important that we ask the meta-ethical question, is there such thing as the moral law, or natural law, as it is called by various medieval thinkers? One should ask, on what grounds can we claim that there is such thing as the moral law, something which dictates our moral duties? Because when we talk about ethics, we're not only trying to talk about what kinds of things we do value, but what kinds of things we ought to value and the ways we ought to act. As such, I think that when we typically go about ethical reasoning, we would like to think that there are such things as rights and duties, for example, which ground our lives and our behavior and which exist apart from anyone's say-so. After all, why would we petition our governments and fight for the recognition of rights which aren't currently enshrined in our laws if we didn't think that there was some sort of obligation or framework which exists beyond the current laws? Many theorists, for example, such as John Stuart Mill, who have looked at natural law theory, have said, well, rights don't actually exist. We think that rights exist, but actually they're just a function of law. And you have other thinkers, such as Thomas Hobbes, as well as, for example, John Locke, and you can bring this back to St. Thomas Aquinas and Augustine, who think that there is something called natural law. And natural law, very plainly, is the way that things are as such, which dictates that we act in certain ways. So, for example, maybe this has to do with excess, where you know that if you accrue, various goods ad infinitum, well, you can't do that. Nature prevents you from example, just collecting as many apples as possible ad infinitum. There's some limit where there's no more apples to collect. So nature, naturally, so the natural law theorists say, has a law regarding excess such that it prevents one from acting beyond certain natural bounds. And this is the sort of stuff that natural law theorists say ground our ethical actions, is that there is a law implicit in nature which can be reached via reason, and we can use logic and we can use deductive arguments and things like this in order to ascertain what is the natural law, some sort of moral order which is implicit in the ontological order. But here, I would like to argue that there's actually no such thing as the moral law or the natural law, and thus duties in the strictest sense. I will be building off of some of the ideas that Rorty has presented in his speech, Do We Need Moral Principles? And he presented this lecture, which I'll leave a link to in the description. It's very interesting. But a lot of the thoughts that he has to say, I think, are very helpful. But I would just like to provide some of the various angles of meta-ethical critique that one can use in order to problematize the notion of the moral law, of absolute moral duties, and things such as this. So the great argument in ethics is which ethical system is right? Should we be utilitarians? Should we be libertarians? Should we be deontologists? Should we be virtue ethicists? Should we be something else? All of these ethical systems bring with them certain ethical principles. These are the real kernel axioms around which these systems orbit. For example, the utilitarian principle is the greatest good for the greatest number, with the greatest good being defined as human happiness or well-being. So anytime I enter into an ethical decision, I'm trying to do a cost-benefit analysis of the goods and the bads, which are associated with either side of an ethical dilemma. And by kind of figuring this out and using a reason-based approach, I figure out, okay, which one is going to provide the greatest good? So for example, in the trolley problem, where you've got the trolley barreling down the track towards 5 people, and you have the option to pull a lever which will divert it to another track with 1 person on it, the utilitarian will say, pull the lever, because killing 1 person versus killing 5 people, less bad, therefore more good, therefore that is the ethical decision to do. And the utilitarian's kind of principle is very central to a lot of the ways that we reason in modern kind of Western societies. But there are other ethical principles. For example, Kant's categorical imperative. And there are a number of kind of layers to this, but we can say roughly that it is do nothing which you could not wish to be an eternal moral law. In other words, ask the question, what if everybody did it? And if it is the case that it could be implemented on that universal level, that everyone could do it and it wouldn't lead to contradictions, then you can do it. So for example, lying, you cannot do lying, because what if everybody lied? Well, no one could trust each other. We couldn't enter the most basic situations of solidarity with other people and act in common. Therefore, one cannot lie because one could not wish that it be an eternal moral law. And furthermore, Kant's categorical imperative states that we should treat one another as ends in themselves, not as means to an end. In other words, we shouldn't use people as if they were objects, as if they were, a mere element in an ethical equation, but as if they have value in and of themselves, not necessarily for the ends which their being used leads to. Now we have another ethical principle, which is the libertarian principle, which says simply that we should maximize freedom. And furthermore, that we should introduce coercive measures, such as laws or the state, only in proportion to the extent to which such measures furnish an environment conducive to this freedom principle, to maximizing freedom. In other words, coercion is only present to the extent to which it allows for us to maintain our freedom via getting rid of certain freedoms, such as, for example, the freedom to murder whoever I want. If that's not going to allow for a society which furnishes this freedom principle, then we subdue that freedom via coercive measures such as laws and the state, and this is how libertarianism works. And this is all very, very surface level kind of general statements about these systems. You can see my lectures that I've done in my political philosophy and ethics playlist, where I go into these systems in much more detail, give examples and whatnot. But these are kind of various ethical principles that centralize these different ethical systems. And when we ask the question that I asked at the beginning, on what grounds can we claim that there is something called the moral law? Well, we run into a number of problems regarding, can any of these systems claim some sort of transcendent truth, some moral weight regarding the actions that they arbit? Well, first off, the notion of a moral law, and thus that any one of these systems may be correct, seems to necessitate an unambiguous and common essence to human moral reasoning. That there is some sort of common way that all of us approach problems, such that these systems adequately explain how we confront problems and therefore how we ought to react to certain problems. It assumes that there is something unambiguous that can be stated in general that is true about the way we humans reason morally. But this doesn't necessarily seem to be the case. It seems certainly fairly obvious that we go about our moral reasoning in very different ways. For example, with this trolley problem I just spoke of, one of the very famous modern ethical dilemmas, I did a survey of my classmates and my family members my senior year of high school because I was curious, how would people react to this? I was expecting most people to give the utilitarian answer, that they would kill the one person by diverting the train via pulling the lever because it would result in less deaths and therefore would be the more moral decision. But I had a lot of people who actually said either they would just leave it up to fate that, the universe was already going in such a way, such that to pull the lever would be to implicate myself in that one person's death. But to sit by and just let the train run over the 5 people would not mean that I am implicated in the situation because it was already going to happen. These are very different ways of approaching the trolley problem and what the right thing to do is. And if you've had any discussions in politics or ethics or religion or anything like this, we have very different ways of going about our reasoning. We are informed by the environment in which we grew up in, and as such, I think this notion that there's some unambiguous common essence to our moral reasoning is at the very least dubious. In addition, the idea of the moral law requires moral agents who are cognizant of the moral law, such that the failure to obey its command is considered neglect of one's duty. Right? It's assumed that everyone knows that there is something called the moral law, with capital letters, such that for someone to neglect this moral law is considered a neglect of some sacred duty that they knew about and they neglected nevertheless. As such, it presumes a lot about the knowledge that moral agents already have, which it seems very difficult to ground. Certainly we can say we all have moral intuitions, and the natural or moral law theorist is going to say that all of these tuitions in general point towards the same source, right? Towards that same Quelle in the German, from which we gain our ethical duties. But this certainly seems very dubious once again in light of the fact that various cultures have various ideas of what it means to act morally and what it means to have moral intuitions. In some societies, for example, female circumcision is very intuitive. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just part of our culture. And of course, we Westerners might scoff at this, but we generally are okay with male circumcision, so we certainly just have different ethical intuitions. And some of us, such as myself, think that no child circumcision should be okay, because that's kind of weird and strange. But this is just the point, right? That we have different intuitions regarding what it means to be cognizant of this moral law. It seems more apt to say that instead of being cognizant of the moral law, we are cognizant of our moral law. And who is us of this our? Well, it's merely one's ethnic group. And think of the notion of ethnicity of being some group who shares common descent. This is what Richard Rorty means when he says that ethical decisions and, in fact, notions of truth are necessarily ethnocentric. That we evaluate what, for example, it means to act ethically within some ethnic framework of some common group of values informed by our environment that we use to determine what is intuitive, what is unintuitive. To talk about intuitions outside of some sort of particular environment seems to make no sense. It's like if someone asked you, okay, I want you to morally reason, but like Kant is going to ask us, I want you to do it independent of considering any ends. I want you just to consider everything as valuable in and of itself and not for the outcomes that it's going to furnish. Well, this would be like asking us to, as Donald Davidson said in one of his papers, it's like being asked to rearrange a closet, but don't rearrange any of the shoes or the coats or the pants. Just rearrange the closet in and of itself. It's like, well, what does that even mean? To arrange requires that I'm tarrying with certain elements and rearranging them. In the same way, to morally reason, it doesn't make any sense to talk about transcendent principles, but rather immanent concerns and intuitions. Another problem with the moral law is that it seems to require that ethics is considered a matter of principles or propositions. Take, for example, the utilitarian thinking about the trolley problem. He's trying to consider value, and he's trying to have some common currency of value by which he can do a cost-benefit analysis and figure out this decision will produce this much good and this much bad, and this one this much good and this much bad. And I weigh these together via some sort of approach in which elements in my ethical decision are propositions, such that I could put my ethical decisions propositionally into a deductive argument or an inductive argument. And I could say that given these premises, this conclusion follows either with certainty if it's deductive or with relative confidence or certainty if it's inductive. But Rorty, as well as many other ethical theorists, have said, no, ethics doesn't seem to be propositional at all. In fact, it only seems to be propositional if we think about it in this modernist philosophical discourse in which we think of human behavior as propositional. But if we, for example, are making a really split-second decision, say you have this trolley problem in front of you, but you don't have any time to decide whether or not you should pull the lever. You just have the moment to act, and either you pull it or you don't. Well, in that case, we might do some sort of kind of rough reasoning of, well, what should I do? But I don't put this propositionally. I'm just acting on my intuition of what do I think is right? And now someone who is an ethicist, who exists in this philosophical discourse, they might look at all this and they might say, well, it's our job to tell you what you ought to value by expressing your values propositionally such that you can figure out what is the reasoning behind your principles. But philosophy may sometimes be going too far when it claims that, in fact, our intuitions can be reduced to propositions, instead of there being some irreducible amount of uncertainty and kind of untranslatability to principles inherent in our actions. Also, moral law theory seems to assume a moral framework whose existence can be determined, in line with what I've just said, in the abstract, via deductive arguments, via logical abstractions such as principles, as well as some inherently deliberative faculty that's possessed by all moral agents by which they can reliably, constantly, and subconsciously recognize and hearken to the moral law, that faculty being reason. So when I mentioned earlier that in order to ascertain the natural law, one uses their reason to figure out, for example, that I can't accrue apples ad infinitum because there's only so many apples in this world. In the same way, this moral law theory or natural law theory is assuming that you have some sort of framework for proper action which is best reached in the abstract, away from particulars, and solely achieved in this ideal register. This is a very Platonic notion of, for example, what is good? Well, in order to determine what's a good action for me to do, I must know the good, the form of goodness as such, which is the unpredicated quality of goodness, irrespective of any ends or means. It is goodness itself, and that is the ground for my ethical decisions. But it seems that we don't ever actually, even if you say there are such things as these ideas or forms, we never have access to those. We don't deliberate in our lives via these general absolutes, but rather by principles which are tailored to the way our intuitions interact with our immanent conditions. And furthermore, this notion that there's something called reason, something which is inherent to us, which is deliberative, meaning that it is rational, that it is logical, that it proceeds step by step, and that it allows all moral agents to reliably, constantly, and subconsciously do moral reasoning. This seems to be nothing more than a wish, nothing more than what we would like for ourselves as moral agents. We would like to assume that we can reliably, given a ethical, dilemma, that we can reliably figure out what is right, that we are constantly, subconsciously doing ethical reasoning and that therefore we are justified in acting in certain ways. But in fact, I don't think that we have such a promise, such an assurance that the way we act is grounded in some sort of way. In addition, it seems that the moral law has a hard problem differentiating between humans having ascertained knowledge of an immutable moral law and merely a wide state of consensus regarding our opinions. What is the difference between knowing we have reached the moral law via reason, which is this inherent deliberative rational faculty, and us merely using culturally conditioned rationality in order to reach a consensus regarding our opinions about what is best for us? How can we tell the difference? It seems to me that one of the great downfalls of moral or natural law theory is that when they talk about ascertaining something through reason, you could conceivably think of a culture that would not think of reason the same way. You could envision a situation or a time period in the past in which this has not been the most rational thing to do. In the realm of science, for example, we could very well say that at one time it was rational to believe that the world was flat. The evidence simply did not support the conclusion that the earth is a globe. However, now we have various faculties and institutions and reasons by which we can conclude that the earth is a globe with much more certainty than we can it is flat, even though, for example, our intuition of just looking out at the horizon would seem to conclude that it is flat. In the same way, it may have at one time been rational to think morally in such and such a way, and now it is not. Now rationality has changed. And this idea that rationality is some sort of trans-historical faculty that allows us to acquire what is the natural or moral law as such, independent of our particulars, seems to me nothing more than hope. In addition, moral law theory requires there being a moral periphery consisting of moral agents who abide by fundamentally different principles of reason, for example. And these people are somehow still to be held accountable to the natural law. And there's a couple ways that we can parse this situation out. One must either assume that these minority actors, so to speak, are willfully and maliciously unheedful to the moral law, in which case they need to be punished or reformed such that their reason returns to the proper reason. We can assume that they are dumb and ignorant, but still moral agents. Or we can assume that they're not moral agents at all. For example, some sort of inferior species. All of these to me seem to be wrong ways of thinking, to put it frankly. Because when we think of moral reasoning as having some essence grounded in this deliberative faculty of reason, we necessarily find those who are unreasonable, who either are in our societies and not beholden to our laws, in which case it seems difficult to say that they deserve the same privileges we do, and thus the same protections, and thus they need to be some sort of inferior species, which is rife with ill connotations. Or we can say that they're some sort of deficient member still of our moral species, so to speak, and we must reform them and treat them in some sort of patronizing manner. Either way, this notion of the moral periphery is going to be one of the greatest challenges to any generalist notion of what the moral law is. Thus, I'd like to conclude with asking, what is ethics supposed to do? Because this is one of the great meta-ethical questions that one should ask oneself concerning, what system is proper for considering what action is correct. In formulating ethics propositionally, it on the one hand aims to, for example, determine the principles by which we already decide how we ought to act. On the other hand, it seeks to provide principles which dictate how we ought to act in the future. And thus, it critiques the way that we currently reason and tells us we should reason in a different way. There's a subtle difference between these two, but I think it's important. The former, the more descriptive ethical approach, seeks to ground our already existent behavior in principles of right and wrong, of what are the ways in which our intuitions are propositionally determining how we act right now. On the other hand, ethics has traditionally faltered by assuming that our current moral practices are primarily a matter of principle, assuming that the way we act is primarily deliberative, intuitive, and principle-based. And in attempting to derive ethical principles from the variety of actions we do take, an ethical discourse is formed which generalizes human behavior, and to our detriment, by presuming we do act according to rational principles. Therefore, we are making a grave metaphysical assumption based on our metaphysical presuppositions about really how we would like ourselves to be. Not how we are, but how we would like ourselves to be. As Richard Rorty states in this lecture that I mentioned, Do We Need Moral Principles? He states, principles, like laws, are summaries of practices and have little force when they cease to be such summaries. They don't constrain practices, they abbreviate practices. In other words, these moral principles, such as the utilitarian principle, Kant's categorical imperative, the libertarian principle, or some sort of virtue approach ordered towards the common good or something like this, these are not ways of constraining how we ought to act, some sort of transcendent principle which is ahistorical. Rather, they are summaries which abbreviate and describe the way that we tend to act. And this we is the real hard-hitting part and the real ethnocentric part of ethics, ultimately. This we is the group which is the precondition of any deliberative action in the first place. That I am bound to a certain historical group, and I use this to determine what is rational, what is intuitive, what is proper, what is warranted, what is just, what is right. Therefore, I think that we really need to drop this notion of the moral law. It's frankly not very helpful. It goes along with, for example, with this treating moral dissidents, these minority actors, as an inferior species. This turns into, for example, the various Christian empires treating infidels as worthy of being stomped on and killed because they're infidels. Because they don't have the proper religion. They don't know how to reason properly because they've been so deceived by the world that it is our job to step in and perform God's work. Right? There's a lot of problematic political implications behind moral or natural law theory that I think that we need to move beyond. And I think that we would be much benefited to perhaps learn a little bit from what Rorty has to say. So that being said, maybe consider checking out, I think it's about the first 50 minutes of the video, published by Philosophy Overdose, a great channel, is just him talking, and then there's questions after that, but you might learn a thing or two. So that being said, that's it for this lecture. I hope it's been somewhat interesting and helpful in considering this meta-ethical question. Check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other literature. You can become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because books are not cheap, and I'd appreciate anything you have to give. That's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in another one.